Hi, this is Ms. Boone. Today I'm going to teach about the Great Depression. Let me share my screen. Here we go. So, the Great Depression and the New Deal. The New Deal is the government's response to it. It happened between World War I and World War II. Right after World War I, there was a lot of spending, and then things just went really bad. Oops. So, there's a lot to it. It's very complicated because there was a lot of things going on in a lot of different areas of business. I'm going to talk about two major parts though, mostly labor and manufacturing, and then agriculture. So first, with labor, there was a lot of problems with the banking system. In the 1920s, the early 1920s, a lot of people were buying on credit. So I don't have enough money, but I'll borrow from the bank. And they were also buying stocks on credit. A stock is a part of a business. And so they said, oh, hey, I'll buy part of this business, but I'll borrow money to do it. Oh, and I like this business, I'm going to borrow money to buy part of that. And then in 1929, the stock market crashed, and everyone was like, I can't afford this business anymore. I'm selling my part of the business. And a lot of businesses failed, and a lot of banks failed, specifically in the Midwest and, well, throughout the whole country, actually. People couldn't pay back their loans. And so people had to put money in the banks, and then the banks gave it to other people in a loan that they needed to pay it back. Well, people couldn't pay back their loans. And so there were a lot of banks that failed. And so anybody who had money in the bank didn't get their money back. So even more people lost their money. And then there were a lot of problems in the farming. With World War I, they'd had to grow a lot of food that they were selling to the armies and then selling to other countries, especially in Europe, because they didn't have enough food. And after World War I, those countries, one, could raise their own food, and two, they were in a lot of debt. So world trade decreased, and other countries weren't buying our stuff anymore. And so a lot of businesses were having problems. And we talked about with the banks failing, people not buying as much, that businesses had a hard time. And so if you were a shoe factory and people stopped buying shoes, you still have to pay your workers and you have to pay for materials, and it's expensive to run a business, and people stopped buying shoes. And so they said, hey, we're going to kick out some of the workers because we're not making as many shoes. We don't need that many workers. But then all of their families, those that lost jobs, they couldn't pay back their loans either, and they couldn't buy stuff. So they can't buy any more shoes. So the shoe company is having even more problems because everybody's losing their jobs and everybody's broke. So unemployment, people not having jobs, there were over 10 million people unemployed at this time. And that's like 1 out of every 5 people that used to have a job didn't have a job anymore. And there were these huge long lines at soup kitchens for free food because they were literally starving. And then back to the agriculture, there was during this time, specifically starting in 1930, so right after the stock market crashed, there was this drought. And that means it didn't rain, and then the plants didn't grow, and there wasn't any roots to hold the stuff in place, the dirt in place. And so there was these huge sandstorms, like all the way across the country even. And you can see here, there's a car buried in the sand, and there were like whole houses that were buried in sand because this sand was just blowing back and forth. And so there were a lot of people who migrated at this time. There were refugees that went from the Midwest, the South Midwest, Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, Texas, that's the area that the drought was the worst. And they started like leaving to go to the cities, or a lot of them went across country to California because they'd heard there was work there. But then there were way too many people working. And so they were like living in their old broken down cars and in shanty towns, just like a house made of whatever you could. And there were even like refugee camps built in California because there were just too many people there working. And it was a really hard time. Some of the famous books from this time are Out of the Dust, The Grapes of Wrath, Children of the Dust Bowl. There are books about these families because it was just so horrible. And to try to keep the food prices higher so that the big farms in California could sell their stuff and actually make a profit, they were raising too much food and the prices were so low. There were some places that even like burned their food so that they could sell the rest of it for more money. And so burning food to keep the farmers in business versus starving to death for the workers. It was really hard. And then it was also really hard for sharecroppers because they worked on the land, but then they weren't selling the food for enough money. And so they were really suffering. And the government's response was too little, too late. They wanted to help American businesses. And so they said, okay, we're going to start taxing you. Like, we want to help the shoe companies in the United States. So we're going to tax shoes from England. But then the other countries that we started to tax said, we don't like this. We're going to start taxing your imports. And so that made it so that world trade dropped even more because we couldn't sell stuff to other countries because they were mad at us because we said we weren't buying stuff from them. And one of the other things that they tried was to increase taxes so that they could bail out the banks, so that then the banks could help pay back people who'd put money into the banks. But that made it even harder on people who were poor that didn't have money in the banks in the first place. And you can see there's this whole pretty much armies of people going to the government and protesting and saying, hey, we don't have food and you're making our lives worse because you're taxing us. And then there was a lot of the veterans, people who had worked in World War I, the government had said, we promise we'll pay you a bonus in 1945. Well, in 1930, they said, hey, we're starving. Can you pay us the money now? You owe us this money. And President Hoover is like, nope, we can't afford to pay you now. We'll pay you later. And they're like, but we're starving. And we literally risked our lives for this country in World War I. And you're not going to help us? And he actually sent somebody to say, hey, everybody go home. And that person like started burning their makeshift houses and like kicking them out at gunpoint. Anyway, it was a big mess for this. It's called the Bonus Army. And this is a picture of it. So people didn't like that. The government response wasn't a very good thing. And so we elected a new government, a new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. We call him by his initials because his uncle by marriage, Teddy Roosevelt, had been president in like 1901. So new president in 1930, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He worked with Congress to pass a lot of laws to provide relief, recovery, and reform were the big three. They gave money to people, specifically subsidies to farmers. Of course, if you were a sharecropper, the money went to the landowners, so it still wasn't very good. And they tried to send money to businesses to help keep them working. And then they passed laws to try to keep another depression from happening. Um, a depression is an economic depression when the economy goes down. Not like I'm sad, I'm depressed, but the economy was down. So one of the things that they did was they started insuring banks. They said, okay, if you put money in the bank up to $25,000, we will give you your money back, even if the bank goes under. And so this was a law passed. If you go in a bank, you will see a sign like this in almost every bank today, because it's important to people in America now that we have our money insured, that we know we're going to get it back if we put it into a bank. So there were a lot of things that Franklin Delano Roosevelt tried, but the first time they passed these laws, like in the first 100 days of his presidency, like 3 months and a few days, a lot of them weren't legal or weren't constitutional. And so the Supreme Court said, hey, you can't do it that way. And so they had to pass a new round of deals that instead of just like handing money out, they tried to make it more secure. So one of the things they passed was the National Labor Relations Act, which said, okay, businesses, don't lay off your workers and make sure you pay them at least this much money. So that, like, there were a lot of people who didn't have jobs. And so businesses were like saying, hey, we'll pay you less money and you still need work, so you'll come work for us, even though it really wasn't enough to help the families. And so with protecting the wages, it kept people working and made it so that they could have food and support their families. Another thing that they passed was the Social Security Act, which provides retirement benefits and helps you get money if you get injured at work, so that you're not just fired and you have to deal with all the hospital bills. Like, the company where you were working for will help pay for it if you get injured, so that you can still support your family. And then there's something called alphabet soup. This is a picture of a cartoon of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and all of his little buddies are different government agencies that had a lot of acronyms, like the WPA and the PWA and the AAA, that stood for different groups of people that gave people jobs. So this is like economic security. Here are just a couple of them. The Works Progress Administration like provided jobs for builders and painters and actors and writers so that they could provide for their families. And they made a lot of things like city halls and roads. And like, I found a place, you can go to the website here where you can see projects in Utah, and you can actually search by city, like what projects did they do during this time. And in Provo, they actually poured the sidewalks on Center Street in Provo during this time. And there were a lot of different projects that they did everywhere. Like on the mountains in Utah, if you look up, you see there's like lines across the mountains. It's because they dug trenches to keep the avalanches from happening. That was the CCC, or the Civilian Conservation Corps. That was an environmental project. They also did roads and bridges, and they like made trails in all of the national parks, like Arches National Park and Bryce Canyon National Park, Yellowstone National Park. A lot of those were developed by the Civilian Conservation Corps. And so this provided jobs for millions of people. And then if they had jobs, their families could buy stuff, and it helped build the economy. And some people argue that the government still wasn't a very, very effective. Like, it didn't do much. There were still a lot of people who were suffering, but it changed a lot of things about the way we look at government. It changed how we think of liberty. Instead of thinking, oh, we're trying to protect people from the government. That's what liberty is being safe from the government. It changed so that people in America think of liberty as, oh, the government is going to keep me safe from anything bad that could happen. They're going to keep me safe from other armies, and they're going to keep me safe from famine and drought and fires and floods and all of these bad things that could happen. We started thinking that the government should save us. And before the Great Depression, people would ask the question, should the government get involved? There's this problem, like with the labor unions. Should they help us? And after this, it completely changed it so that we would ask, okay, there's this problem. How is the government going to help? It wasn't a question of if anymore. And this is a famous painting from around that time. It's actually 1941. But the idea that the government is going to guarantee we have lots of food and that our families are safe and together. Freedom from want and freedom from fear is things that we started to believe that the government could provide us. But what really ended the Great Depression? World War II, when the government spent a lot of money to pay for the war. The Great Depression really didn't end until the war broke out. Thanks for watching. Enjoy.